In a way, what Father Mark says is true. I said, why don't we have, as the theme of the Institute this year, the cosmic and personal dimensions of eschatology? Well, I took what I consider to be the easier part for myself. And poor Terry has to look at the whole historical range of the various movements that have tried to explain when the end will come. And so the various prophetic figures, self-anointed prophetic figures, have come up through the centuries saying, this is when it will happen. It will happen between such and such a date. So when you're predicting the apocalypse, there's a lot of guesswork involved. But none of you would call me a prophet if I said between August 1st in the year 2000 and August 1st in the year 2100, all of us will have to face our own death. You'd hardly consider me a prophet to say that. Unless, of course, the Lord returns first. Okay? Oh, yes, I'm limited in my time. I have to remember that. So we have to look at individual death as sort of a personalized reflection of what will happen cosmically with the eschaton, with the second coming of Christ. The culmination, the consummation of all of world history in the return of the Lord is reflected in our own personal death. And all of us, unless I said, if the Lord returns first, we won't have to deal with it, but if he tarries and we die before his return, we will have to face our individual death. Terry, this afternoon, made a very interesting remark. He said, if you look at the various teachings regarding the second coming of Christ, the eschaton, the apocalypse, Orthodox have been infected by a lot of the popular theories and theologies afoot in the world. I dare say the same thing is true about the Orthodox understanding of the individual experience of death and what happens at death, what happens in the afterlife. If it is important, as indeed it is, to correct Orthodox misperceptions because of our being infected by the spirit of this world about the second coming, we also must test our ideas about what happens at our individual death to make sure that the teaching to which we adhere, what we pass on to our children, what we pastors pass on to our parishioners, is in accord with the teachings of the fathers. So, I am very happy to be here at this conference and to address this topic. But I want to give two caveats as we begin. The first is, whenever you talk about something like death, you have to be very careful. Careful because not one of us has experienced death and judgment and returned to tell about it. Not one of us in this room. I certainly have not. And we must be very careful of remarks, of stances, of positions that are articulated regarding personal eschatology, personal death, and we have to be very careful about what we claim to know. There's a humility in this kind of investigation that we must maintain. The fathers tell us very carefully it is not wise to get into questions that are beyond our understanding because God has not seen fit to reveal all the details to us. In other words, we've got to be careful that we don't go too far and ascribe to ourselves a knowledge that we don't have. That's the first caveat. But the second caveat is more positive. We have to be confident in dealing with this question of death, that you and I, who are baptized into Christ, are part of him who conquered death. We're part of the victory of death. And so we can't come at these questions with fear, with trembling. The victory over death which Christ won is ours because we will be heir of the kingdom that he establishes because of our baptism into him. So we come to this question with a great deal of humility, not being able to say, we know this for certainty unless the Lord has revealed it to us explicitly. But we come with a certain amount of confidence to this question as well, because he who is victorious over death is the Lord to whom we belong. So those are the two basic methodological points I want to make. As I was leaving to come here, I went to my office to get my notes. And I came across one of my colleagues. And he said, gee, where are you going? I said, I'm going to Alaska to give a series of 4 talks. He said, about what? I said, death. He says, my, that's morbid. And without thinking twice, I said, only if you think death is the end, and only if you're afraid of it. And every now and then the Holy Spirit does inspire me to say things like that. And I really believe that that's the attitude that we have to bring to this. Death is serious business. Death is not a pretty affair. Death takes from us our loved ones. It takes from us our own lives. And yet we are not defeated by death. We will share in the ultimate victory over death, and we have to look at all these questions from that perspective. I remember when I first started graduate school, I had a professor who was very much into modern Protestant theology. And he sort of set his sights on me. He wanted me to be one of his proteges, and he said, well, tell me, Ted, what do you want to study? I said, I'm very interested in getting to know more about the writings of the early church fathers, studying patristic theology. And he said to me, they're just so obsessed with death. And I said, aren't we all? Is there not a human being, if they have a healthy psychology, that doesn't have some kind of questions that come from the fact that we are finite, and somehow we have to answer the question, what happens to me when the end of my life comes? I am not an infinite being that controls the universe, as much as we might like to delude ourselves into thinking that's the case. We have to come to terms with these questions. So, the central kerygma, the central proclamation of Christianity is really about death and the victory over death. No matter how lax an Orthodox is, and isn't this the truth? When do they tend to show up during the church year? Holy Week, Great Week. When the drama of Christ's death and resurrection is represented to us. There is nothing like the Holy Saturday liturgy in the morning and the resurrection service in the evening. Even those whose spiritual sensibilities are hardened, something in that touches them. It strikes a chord with them. It plugs into their basic experience as a human being. And I have to tell you that Orthodox writers throughout the centuries, beginning with the Fathers, but coming down even to the present time, have written a lot about death. And I want to give you a few books, a few titles for you to add to your notes in case you'd like to check what I say against people who know far more about this topic than I do, and also to expand perhaps on some of the things that are presented here in the conference. The topic of death has not been ignored by any stretch of the imagination in modern Orthodox circles. Many of you are familiar with the writings of Father Seraphim Rose. He wrote a book called The Soul After Death, which was published in 1980. Another very helpful book, written to a large extent in reaction to what Father Rose said, was a book by then Father Lev Pohalo. This book was titled The Soul, the Body, and Death. The Soul, the Body, and Death. It was published in 1981. How many of you have read either of these books? Either one? I'm curious, how many of you have read Father Seraphim's book alone? And how many of you have read Father Lev's? Not many. Okay. Interesting. I just see a few people who have read it back there. It's very important to look at both of these works to understand what some of the tension is, and I will do that in my presentations, what some of the tensions are in discussing the Orthodox understanding of death. But I want to recommend a very good book, more recent than these two, which if you can buy only one of them, this is the one to buy. This is by then Archimandrite, but now Metropolitan Ierotheos Vlachos, who is the Metropolitan of Nafpatos in Greece. And he wrote a book recently called Life After Death. Life After Death. Now, if you have been caught in some of the camp crossfire between those who have read Father Rose and those who have read Father Puhalo and are sort of firing at each other because they have different understandings. The book that resolves a lot of these tensions in a very solid theological and patristic way is this book by Erotheos Vlachos, and I recommend it extremely highly. So, these are three of the works that I'll be drawing from, as well as trying to give some of my own synthesis of the questions that these authors present. Understanding death is within the domain of Christianity. You know, one of the great things about teaching at a college, and even though it's a secular liberal arts college, I have a lot of students who come to me because they know I'm a priest. And I got this email a while back from a student who was not religious at all in her upbringing. She says, "Hello, Professor Pulcini. As you can tell from my email address, I'm writing because I was wondering if you would be available for a meeting." And here's what she says. You'll love this. "I know this sounds crazy, but over the past few weeks, I have been having a personal crisis of sorts regarding," now listen to what she lists. She lists three elements. "I've been having a personal crisis of sorts regarding religion, death, and God." Okay? Notice the order. So it shows that this is really a central issue in Christian self-understanding. And it is something that we have to look at carefully because, as I will explain, it affects so many aspects of our own theology. We have to be able to answer these questions because if we don't, like in so many other areas of the Christian life, the secular machinery of publishing takes over our territory. We've already lost a good deal of territory because the secular press has made death a hot-selling issue, hasn't it? How many of you have heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross? How many? Everyone's heard of her. When I was in seminary, it used to be a mantra to learn the stages of death and dying. Denial, anger, bargaining. You know, depression, acceptance, and death, and health. And depression, acceptance, and hope. It was like a mantra. We sort of looked at this as the ultimate expression of the teaching regarding death. In many ways, the secular culture had invaded the territory that was proper to Christianity. How many of you have read Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life? Okay? This book, written in 1975, became almost a sacred text for people. And the teaching, the traditional teaching of the church, was displaced by this kind of writing. At Dickinson College, where I teach, there are faculty summer groups. You study a certain issue. One of the faculty study groups, a summer ago, studied death as a process in American society. What did they use as the book of spiritual orientation toward death? The Tibetan Book of the Living and the Dead. Okay? In other words, Christianity was kept almost completely out of the discussion, and a Buddhist understanding of death was introduced as the spiritual perspective to be considered. And finally, let me just notice that the Wall Street Journal had an article in February of this past year, and as you know, probably no newspaper gives a sense of the real spirituality of economic America than the Wall Street Journal. And this article states very clearly that boomers, baby boomers, begin to look beyond the good life to the good death. And what it describes is how people are trying to shape their own funeral services. What will happen to them at their death and what will happen to them as they are memorialized in funeral services and so forth. Giving themselves the false impression that yes, they have control even over what happens to them at death and in their funerals. Okay? So this is a part of modern American consciousness, and unless we're able to answer the hard questions about death, our territory will be ceded very quickly to the secular press and secular modes of analyzing this. And just as I was coming over here, I was reading the newspaper on the airplane. How many of you saw a special that was on television last night called Mysterious Ways? It was about the experience of death and dying, a full hour special. Also, Beyond Chance, which is a show that's on television these days, deals with this kind of topic a lot. And the concern with the supernatural, dealing a lot with the incidence of death, is Touched by an Angel. Now, most of you have heard of Touched by an Angel. Now, I'm not saying anything bad about these programs. I'm just saying the secular machinery of our culture will take over if we don't stand our ground. Okay. Why death is important as a theological category is that it affects so much of Orthodox theology in general. The first area of theology that we have to look at before we can really properly understand death from the Orthodox perspective is Orthodox anthropology. What that means is, how does the Orthodox faith understand the human being? You cannot understand what happens to the human being at death unless you first have a clear understanding of what Orthodox theology teaches about the human being. How many of you have heard this statement? Complete this statement for me. The purpose of religion is to save your soul. You've all been indoctrinated this way, and it's erroneous. It's heretical. That is the first misconception we have to get over. The personal faith that we have in God, the purpose of salvation is not to save your soul, but to save your entire person. God is interested in saving us as human beings in toto, not just souls. Okay? In technical language, human beings in Orthodox understanding are psychophysical unities. Each one of us is an inextricable union of body and soul together. The human being is not just a soul encased in a body, and despite what modern culture teaches about the obsession with the body, we're not a body that has some kind of spiritual faculty. We are body and soul inextricably linked. This is the way we were created. And this basic understanding of the human being is derived fully from the biblical sense of human beings found both in the Old and New Testaments. And this is where I want to make a very important point. In the Old Testament, in ancient Israel, human beings were seen as basically animated bodies. The biblical view is God shaped Adam, okay, the human being, and breathed into Adam the breath of life, the nephesh. You can see how ancients thought this, by the way, because if you were with someone who had died, what did you see? You saw the person there, and as they breathed their last, the idea was that the nephesh, the breath of life which God had breathed into the body to animate it, had passed out of the body, and that's what caused the body to be dead. Okay? Now this view of the human being as a body animated was later countered by a more Greek idea, where if the Hebrews thought of human beings as animated bodies, the Greeks tended to see human beings as incarnated spirits. You see the difference? The Hebrew conception was human beings are above all else an animated body. The Greek view was what we are incarnated spirits. We're spirits that happen to be housed in a body. Now, this different emphasis has had an impact on the way Christians think about the human person, about death. I think that we are way too influenced in many ways by dualism. Okay? Now, you're going to see when I get on my soapbox about this in a little while, but just keep this note in mind, that we have adopted a far too Hellenic and Hellenistic view of the human being as somehow a spirit housed, and it's a very small step from that for saying a spirit imprisoned in a body. This is not the biblical view. The biblical view is this inextricable union of body and soul. This Greek philosophical dualism fed into our theology in many ways, and it's always been fought by the fathers, but on a popular level, it's won in many ways. I would go to funeral homes all the time and hear people say, it's so good to see that they're finally liberated from this life, liberated from the body, set free. This is a more Greek understanding, a Platonic understanding of death, and is not one totally in line with what the biblical teaching is concerning the human person. Because of the importation of philosophy as a method and a language of theology, philosophy has given us this impression. This is the first thing I want to underscore as something that we have to look at and challenge. Okay, so what is the soul? And this is important to understand if we're going to talk about death. And its basic definition is what? The separation of body and soul. So what are we talking about when we're talking about the separation of the soul from the body? The body is complex, made of many elements. When the body dies, it disintegrates, and the elements pass back into the earth. We know that we're made of many elements because of the remains that are left after the body enters into a process of natural decay. The soul, however, is simple. It is not made up of various elements. But the soul has various capacities, and these are important to understand. I remember when I was a freshman in high school, my grandmother died. This was really the first person who had died in my life that I knew very well and loved very deeply and saw day to day and knew her in, probably more intimately than I knew anyone else because I'd spent so much time in her presence. And I remember going to the funeral home and seeing her body there and saying, it looks like her, but now what is missing? It was obviously not her. All right? The psychophysical unity of body and soul had been disrupted. What does the soul impart to the body? It's one thing to say it enlivens the body, but how? The basic thing is that the soul gives its body its appetites, the need to eat, the need to sleep, the need to drink, sexual impulse. I mean, when's the last time you saw a corpse with any of those needs? Obviously, when the soul departs from the body, those appetites go with the soul. Okay? The powers of intellect are also part of the soul, the capacity of the soul. The ability to think, to abstract, to form logical thoughts. These are abilities that are given to a human person by virtue of the indwelling of the soul in the body. When the soul departs the body, it's very rarely, if ever, that you've seen a corpse think. But the part, if I can put it that way, the aspect, the power of the soul that is of most concern to most of the fathers of the church is that aspect of the soul known as nous. And I will say a little bit about this. So the soul is an enlivening presence that permeates the entire body. At death, when the soul separates from the body, the appetites cease, the intellect that we have, the way we think about things, ceases. Now please, don't understand me to say that the soul doesn't have any consciousness. I'm not saying that. You got that? But the intellect as we presently know it ceases, and the nous, this so-called highest or purest part of the soul, is what the fathers are most concerned with in talking about the soul after death. Now, what is this nous? How many, for years, whenever I would read biblical texts, I would always be confused by talking about body, soul, and spirit. And there's no consistency among the various writers who use those terms. Body and spirit are sometimes given as the two aspects of human beings, okay? Body, soul, and spirit is a way of talking about the body, the soul having these powers of intellect and appetite, and the nous as being the highest part of the human person, the spirit, that part which connects us to perception of the divine. Why are you here? Why are you a church person? Why do you pray? Why are you spiritually seeking? The fathers say it's easy to explain this. There is an aspect of your soul that perceives something beyond the material world, more than appetites and more than intellect. There's something in every human being that perceives somehow that there's a transcendent reality and that we want to connect with that. There's something beyond just what we can shape and experience through our senses. So, the nous then is what the fathers call the eye of the soul. Sometimes they call it even the chariot of the soul, because as the nous is trained in the Christian life, it can either lead the soul upwards, so to speak, to the things of God, or it can weigh the soul down by enmeshing the soul in the things of the material world. All right? Now, this is important to keep in mind, because when we talk about what we can do to prepare for a good death, and what it is that the church is concerned to do for us after the separation of soul from body. It is the nous, which is the focus of their attention. And you will see in a lot of writings about the perception of the soul after death that the soul has a noetic awareness. A noetic awareness. What that means is the nous continues to perceive. Now, why do the fathers say that the appetite or the intellect as we presently know it don't continue to exist and function? It's simply because the soul needs the body to interact with the world. And intellect as we know it, and appetites as we know it, mental activity as we know it, and appetites as we know it, are dependent on the soul being in the body. But when the soul passes out of the body, it still has awareness. And that awareness is noetic awareness, the awareness of the spirit, of the nous.